Brian Gardner is here. He's the chief Washington policy strategist at Stifel. Brian, great to have you. Let's start with antitrust.
Kelly, good afternoon. Happy New Year. Thanks for having me. Like you said, it's going to be quiet on the congressional front, at least unproductive on the congressional front. But antitrust, the FTC has already been gearing up at looking at the rules for antitrust laws. And so I think you're going to see more of a push than you've already started to see in 2021. You'll see more of that push in 2022 with a couple of sectors probably most in focus: ag, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, financials, social media, tech. Those are and transportation as well. Those are probably the primary areas that the FTC and the DOJ will focus on.
Some of those are interesting because we don't talk about them that much, like ag and health and transportation. So at the risk of, again, sidelining them, let's just ask on the tech piece of it. If I'm an investor in Facebook or Amazon or Apple, I mean, what are the big risks you see out there in terms of policy?
I'm not sure that, we're talking about breakup, but I think the focus of these investigations and policy initiatives are going to be heavy on data security, privacy, consumer rights, that area. So I think that's and I kind of meld that in with antitrust because I think the FTC will use its antitrust powers to get into these areas in addition to its consumer protection role.
So that said, is it kind of a big announcements, but not a lot of big market impact kind of year? I mean, let's then broaden it out to all of those topics that you mentioned. Which ones do you think could have the biggest market impact?
So, on market impact, I think the first reaction a lot of people have is that regulation's bad and stocks are going to sell off. I take a slightly different view in that it raises the barriers of entry. So it locks in the current market and actually protects current market players, industry players that have built-in advantages. So I think actually the current players actually benefit. There's less of a risk to them than people perceive. So I think people could be surprised across the board by the market reaction. There could be a short-term sell-off, but longer term, I think it actually benefits current players.
Interesting. So then outside of tech, you mentioned a couple of other areas to watch. What are you hearing in terms of the kinds of actions we could see, whether on health or ag or transportation?
The DOJ and FTC have already gone down the road of looking at a couple of mergers in the railroad space last year. I think you're going to see more of that. In financials, we talk a lot about banking, but there was a big merger in the insurance world with Aon and Willis that was blocked. I think you could see more of that. Kind of pivoting back to financial, since I mentioned them, I think you're going to see a lot of work outside the FTC, more at the banking regulators, of them revising, their merger guidelines. And that's going to affect mostly the largest banks. You're going to see more of an emphasis on financial stability. Does a larger bank pose a greater risk, or how much of a greater risk to the financial system? And then competitiveness issues in line with what the Biden administration had put out earlier in 2021.
All right. So then as a final call, Brian, what do you think happens in the midterms?
In the midterms, I think it's an easy call on the House. So I'll start there. I think Republicans are really well positioned to pick up the House and win it back. The Senate's tougher. The Senate's it's not a national election because only a third of the Senate is running. And it's actually if you look at the Senate map, it's not that bad for Democrats. So, I can go through a couple scenarios where I can actually have Democrats picking up a seat in the Senate. But I can also see Republicans winning the Senate. So Senate's too close to call this far out. House is definitely, to the extent that you can say 10 months out, something's definitely going to happen. I feel very confident that Republicans will win the House.
All right. We will check in and see how that turns. Thank you so much for your time today, Brian. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Kelly.
Brian Gardner with Stifel.